perhaps the most quietly unsettling thing lurking in your modern kitchen is that single, forgotten glass of water resting on the counter overnight. It is not that the water has overnight turned toxic or lethal, but rather that your instinctual brain has already subtly decided that it feels deeply suspicious. Meanwhile, across the vast and dusty stretch of human history, our ancestors routinely drank from rushing rivers, bubbling springs, muddy pools, wild animal tracks, and whatever hollowed-out tree trunk had not yet been claimed by a resident frog. There were no pristine filters, no purifying chlorine, and absolutely no tiny, helpful warning labels whispering that the liquid may contain some form of civilization-ending diarrhea. So, how did these ancient humans manage to survive so long without access to clean, sparkling water? The true answer is not that their stomachs possessed some magical resilience, nor that their immune systems were utterly indestructible, nor even that everyone quietly and completely replaced water with fermented beer. Ancient people certainly got sick, and tragically, many of them died. Yet, they were also remarkably skilled observers. Living intimately within wild landscapes, they understood far better than most of us modern humans understand our own complicated household plumbing. They watched and learned exactly where water flowed, where it quietly settled, when it slowly spoiled, and which precious sources were ultimately worth the gamble. For them, survival began with the daily, practical art of choosing the least terrible option available. Long before humans could ever invent deep wells, charcoal filters, clay pipes, or make the incredibly brave decision to drink something mysteriously bubbling near the carcass of a dead mammoth, biological evolution had to solve a far more fundamental problem. How do you keep a large, highly active primate alive and thriving in hot, arid landscapes? For us, water is simply not optional equipment. It faithfully carries vital nutrients, meticulously regulates core temperature, smoothly lubricates working joints, supports delicate digestion, and prevents our life-giving blood from thickening into a biologically inconvenient syrup. The resilient human body can miraculously survive for weeks without food under certain conditions, but severe, relentless dehydration becomes agonizingly dangerous within a matter of days. This harsh reality meant that our wandering ancestors did not simply drift randomly across the savannah, hoping a cool lake would magically appear before lunchtime. Instead, their every movement was inexorably tied to the rhythms of water. Part of the elegant solution was already quietly hardwired inside the human body. Humans are, rather uniquely, incredibly effective sweaters. This capacity to sweat profusely helped our ancestors remain remarkably active in the crushing heat, especially during grueling long-distance walking and relentless persistence hunting. However, this physiological superpower came with a painfully expensive subscription fee: constant, unyielding water loss. The very same adaptation that allowed a determined hunter to keep moving under the blazing midday sun also guaranteed that he would eventually, inevitably need to find a drink. Evolution graciously gave us an excellent cooling system, and then immediately handed us the heavy bill. Early humans also cleverly received a steady supply of water through their daily diet. Succulent fruits, fibrous roots, crisp leaves, raw meat, blood, and fresh animal organs all contain precious, hidden moisture. In certain rich environments, food could supply a highly meaningful share of a person's daily hydration, mercifully reducing the constant need to kneel down beside every questionable puddle. Yet, this food-based moisture was always merely a helpful supplement, never a magical, permanent replacement for drinking water itself. A delightfully juicy tuber is certainly helpful, but it is not a municipal reservoir. The real, defining prerequisite for survival was deep behavioral intelligence. Humans learned their surrounding landscapes socially, passing wisdom down through generations. Wise, older group members could vividly remember which hidden springs survived the harshest dry seasons, exactly where rain collected in secret rock depressions, which slow river bends became dangerously stagnant, and how far the next truly dependable source lay beyond the distant ridge. This vital knowledge was never mere trivia. It was crucial survival infrastructure stored safely within the sanctuary of human memory. Human groups also had to carefully organize their entire lives around this mental map of knowledge. Nomadic camps were often strategically placed within practical walking reach of a water source, but not necessarily directly on top of it, where swarming insects, lurking predators, sudden flash floods, and foul animal waste could easily turn a convenient location into a terrible, lethal neighborhood choice. Instead, people would make targeted visits to a source, swiftly collect what they desperately needed, and quietly retreat back to much safer ground. So, long before humans ever learned to clean water, they did something far more fundamental. They built a highly sophisticated mental map of ecological risk. Indeed, the very first water technology was not a clay pot, a woven filter, or a dug well. It was simply the profound wisdom of knowing exactly where to go. Yet, finding water was only half the immense problem. The other, more perilous half was deciding whether that shimmering water was actually going to hydrate your weary body, or instead begin a very painful, intensely personal disagreement with your intestines. Ancient humans, of course, did not understand the invisible worlds of harmful bacteria, stealthy parasites, or microscopic contamination. Nobody looked down into a murky, still pond and calmly said, "The pathogen count seems elevated." Yet, they possessed an innate, highly developed ability to recognize recurring patterns, and natural selection is famously, brutally efficient at rewarding those observant creatures who notice when specific choices repeatedly lead to disastrous ends. Flowing, active water was almost always far preferable to the heavy stillness of stagnant pools. A cool, crystalline spring emerging directly from the heart of a solid rock was infinitely more reliable and pure than a shallow, tepid puddle baked by the unforgiving sun and visited by every desperate, thirsty animal in the region. Sparkling clear water was not automatically safe, nor was murky, muddy water instantly deadly, but subtle, vital clues lay hidden in the appearance, the sharp smell, the metallic taste, the cool temperature, and the specific location of the source. Observing animal behavior undoubtedly offered invaluable guidance as well. Well-worn animal trails could guide observant humans toward deeply hidden springs or fleeting seasonal pools. Even so, following beasts was hardly a flawless system of quality control. A sturdy gazelle can happily drink from a muddy wallow that would plunge a delicate human digestive system into an agonizing, week-long spiritual crisis. Nevertheless, animals remained vital guides, revealing where precious liquid lay hidden, particularly across vast, arid terrains. Lush vegetation offered yet another living map. Dense clusters of moisture-loving plants, unseasonably green patches during parched droughts, swarms of hovering insects, frantic bird activity, and the stately presence of certain water-seeking tree species all whispered secrets of shallow groundwater or a hidden source nearby. Desperate people could also search beneath the dusty, cracked surface of dry stream beds, digging patiently where water had recently flowed and waiting for the slow, precious moisture to seep gently into a shallow, hand-carved hole. The initial attempt might yield nothing but a thick, unappetizing mixture resembling muddy soup. Yet, after the heavy sediment slowly settled to the bottom, the clear upper layer could be carefully skimmed, becoming surprisingly drinkable. Deep rock cavities and ancient tree hollows quietly collected pristine rainwater. Heavy morning dew could be painstakingly gathered from broad leaves at dawn, and in frozen, biting environments, clean snow and glistening ice could be melted over crackling fires. Resourceful coastal clans obtained significant, life-saving moisture from juicy shellfish and other marine foods, while resilient desert populations memorized the exact locations of deep roots, succulent fruits, and specialized plants that safely stored precious water deep underground. None of these clever methods guaranteed absolute safety. They were simply ways of gradually tipping the evolutionary odds in humanity's favor, and those survival odds improved dramatically through the power of collective memory. One wanderer drank from a cool, shaded spring and walked away healthy and strong. Another unfortunate soul drank downstream from a decaying carcass and spent the next 2 agonizing days deeply reconsidering every single life decision that had brought them to that wretched spot. Both contrasting experiences were transformed into invaluable information. Humans possess an exceptional, beautiful gift for turning individual, isolated suffering into vital group knowledge. Through whispered stories, stark warnings, daily habits, and sacred taboos, communities preserved practical rules of survival long before anyone possessed the science to understand why those rules actually worked. Do not drink from that specific creek after a sudden, heavy rain. Never camp beside that stagnant pool late in the searing dry season. Let the dark mud settle completely. Always collect your water from the untouched upstream side. This was prehistoric water treatment in its earliest, most intuitive form. Not a physical sterilization of the source, but a poetic reading of the land, testing its limits, remembering its dangers, and tenderly teaching the next generation which painful mistakes were entirely unnecessary. Eventually, as centuries slowly bled into millennia, humans stopped treating water as a fleeting prey they had to constantly chase, and began boldly forcing the landscape to yield it on demand. This profound, revolutionary shift appears with beautiful clarity in the dusty archaeological record through the sudden emergence of hand-dug wells. Some of the most breathtakingly remarkable examples of this transition come from the early Neolithic farming communities of Central Europe. Well-preserved wooden wells discovered in the fertile soils of modern-day Germany have been meticulously dated to roughly 5069 to 5098 BC. These were by no means crude, shallow pits scraped into the dirt by desperate people merely hoping for the best. Instead, their highly skilled builders meticulously shaped massive oak timbers using simple stone tools, joined them into sophisticated, carefully fitted interlocking structures, and lowered them deep into the dark earth to tap the pristine groundwater below. This monumental achievement matters because a well completely rewrote the entire survival equation for humanity. Exposed surface water is dangerously vulnerable. Wild animals drink from it, waste washes freely into it, and harsh sunlight warms it into a breeding ground. A seasonal drought can easily shrink a once vibrant river into a stagnant, concentrated puddle of thick mud, buzzing insects, and bitter regret. Groundwater, by beautiful contrast, has naturally trickled through deep, protective layers of soil, fine sand, and porous rock, which slowly filter out suspended debris and significantly reduce certain forms of microscopic contamination. Of course, not all groundwater is inherently safe. A deceptively crystal-clear well can still harbor invisible pathogens, toxic minerals, or harmful chemical contaminants. Modern archaeology does not support the overly comforting, romanticized idea that these ancient, deep wells produced perfect bottled water, adorned with a charmingly rustic label. Yet, when compared thoughtfully with a stagnant open pool lying exposed beside a bustling settlement, a carefully protected well could offer a far more stable and easily controllable source of life. Building such a wonder, however, required far more than mere, desperate thirst. People had to deeply understand precisely where the elusive groundwater might be found, systematically organize collective labor, excavate immense amounts of heavy soil, skillfully prevent the fragile shaft from collapsing, shape timber with meticulous precision, and faithfully maintain the demanding structure long after its initial construction. In other words, these earliest wells were not merely simple holes in the ground. They were monumental community projects, born of shared struggle. They also profoundly reveal how a settled way of life dramatically intensified the eternal water problem. Mobile hunter-gatherers could effortlessly leave whenever a precious water source failed or became hopelessly contaminated. But farmers possessed permanent fields, carefully stored grain, sturdy houses, vulnerable livestock, and close neighbors who had apparently decided to remain nearby forever. Once people fully invested in these permanent settlements, packing up and moving every single time the local stream became dark and unpleasant was no longer an attractive or practical business model. Reliable, clean water therefore slowly but surely became an integral part of architecture. It directly determined precisely where villages could grow, how long communities could remain deeply rooted in one place, and exactly how many humans and animals a given area could comfortably support. The silent archaeological evidence does not tell us the legendary name of the first visionary person who boldly suggested digging downward instead of walking endlessly farther, but it beautifully preserves the physical result. Sturdy timber walls deeply buried in ancient, silent soil, built by determined people who had gradually transformed water from a lucky, fleeting discovery into planned, enduring infrastructure. The seasonal puddle had finally become a public utility. Here is precisely where the grand story becomes deeply frustrating, because the single most interesting question is also the most painfully difficult one to prove. Did these prehistoric humans deliberately and knowingly treat their water before drinking it? They certainly possessed at least some of the necessary rudimentary technology. Humans had masterfully controlled fire long before the clever invention of pottery, and later communities heated vital liquids in crude ceramic vessels or by carefully dropping fire-heated stones directly into containers, dug pits, woven baskets, or hide-lined hollows. Modern experiments clearly show that these glowing, hot stones can easily bring water to a vigorous boil, but proving that ancient people boiled water specifically to kill invisible, deadly pathogens is quite another matter entirely. The act of boiling leaves behind very little archaeological evidence. A dusty hearth merely proves that someone once made a warm fire. A cracked, weary stone may only show repeated, intense heating and rapid cooling. A ceramic pot can preserve microscopic traces of cooked food. Absolutely none of these silent objects comes conveniently adorned with a label reading, "Emergency drinking water prepared because the local stream looked medically adventurous." People most probably heated water for cooking, gently softening tough food, extracting precious fat, processing wild plants, preparing soothing medicines, or making nourishing broths. Any accidental reduction in waterborne disease may initially have been a highly useful, fortunate side effect rather than the consciously intended goal. They did not require modern germ theory to notice that certain daily practices produced fewer unpleasant, painful consequences, but archaeology very rarely preserves the fleeting human observation itself. This exact same problem applies to the delicate art of straining water through cloth, sand, grass, bark, or crushed charcoal. These natural materials can successfully remove tiny insects, thick mud, and floating, suspended particles. Allowing water to quietly settle in a container can also make it visibly clearer. Yet, clearer does not necessarily mean microbiologically safe. A crude, homemade filter may slightly improve texture and appearance, while leaving the truly ambitious, microscopic organisms completely untouched. Then, there is the highly popular, romanticized claim that ancient humans easily survived dirty water simply because they possessed far stronger immune systems. To some extent, they may indeed have developed a partial, hard-won immunity to certain specific local pathogens after repeated perilous exposure. Their gut microbiomes and early childhood exposure also differed drastically from ours today. But this was by no means a flawless biological armor. Contaminated water still relentlessly caused devastating diarrhea, painful parasites, severe dehydration, and tragic death, especially among vulnerable children. Ancient, silent cemeteries are certainly not evidence of a prehistoric wellness trend. And no, people did not universally or magically solve this existential problem by drinking flowing beer instead of water. The natural fermentation and heating during the brewing process could indeed reduce some dangerous risks in certain specific settings, but beer required grain, immense labor, specialized containers, and, most ironically, a reliable source of water in the very first place. A nomadic, mobile Paleolithic band was certainly not hauling a heavy, refrigerated keg across the vast, sun-baked savanna. The honest, unvarnished conclusion is perhaps less dramatic, yet infinitely more fascinating. Ancient peoples likely employed a diverse array of water-improving techniques across different geographic regions and historical epochs, though the surviving archaeological evidence remains frustratingly uneven. Some of these methods are technologically plausible for their time. Others are only historically documented much later in the human story. Still others are merely modern survival tactics projected retroactively onto the distant past. Prehistory, after all, rarely grants us a clear, written confession. Instead, it leaves us with a trail of tantalizing clues. Once water became truly dependable, it ceased being merely a liquid to quench individual thirst. It transformed into the very axis around which entire societies organized themselves. A single permanent well possessed the quiet magic to anchor a temporary campsite and turn it into a bustling, enduring village. A deep, carefully constructed reservoir could carry a fragile community safely through the harshest dry season. Ingenious channels could direct the life-giving flow toward thirsty fields, domestic animals, busy workshops, steamy baths, bustling kitchens, and sacred places of worship. The very moment humans began controlling water on a grand scale, Simple hydration transformed into complex politics. Someone had to do the grueling work to dig. Someone had to diligently maintain the crumbling walls. Someone had to make the difficult decision of who drank first when the water level dropped perilously low. And someone, quite inevitably, stood nearby loudly explaining that the current water shortage was entirely the fault of the previous administration. Across the diverse landscapes of the ancient world, different communities patiently developed their own unique solutions. Resourceful people built deep cisterns to capture precious rainwater, carved precise channels directly into solid stone, carefully lined storage pits to prevent precious leakage, and diligently transported water in heavy ceramic vessels. Within growing cities, public fountains and communal wells blossomed into vibrant social centers. These were lively places where citizens eagerly exchanged daily news, delicately negotiated arranged marriages, loudly argued about troublesome neighbors, and patiently performed the timeless, universal ritual of waiting in line behind someone who had brought far too many containers. Concurrently, water acquired a deeply sacred meaning. Natural springs, flowing rivers, and deep wells were frequently revered as sacred spaces intimately connected to powerful gods, miraculous healing, abundant fertility, or spiritual purification. This was never merely empty superstition floating harmlessly above the realities of practical life. A protected, sacred spring was often, in reality, a meticulously maintained communal resource. Strict ritual rules actively controlled who could approach its sacred waters, when it could be used, and what specific kinds of contamination were forbidden in its vicinity. In this way, ancient religion sometimes functioned as a highly effective form of environmental management, only gifted with much better storytelling. In time, medicine inevitably became involved as well. While ancient physicians possessed no knowledge of microscopic pathogens, some astute observers recognized that the fundamental quality of water varied dramatically by its source, the changing season, its distinct taste, its telling smell, and its geographic location. To improve its character, water could be allowed to settle quietly, strained through fine fabric, deliberately exposed to heat, or carefully mixed with other corrective substances. The simple cloth strainer, which would later become famously associated with the rigorous medical tradition of Hippocrates, was originally intended to filter out visible impurities from freshly boiled water. While it was certainly not a modern scientific purifier, it reflected a profound, revolutionary shift in human consciousness. People were no longer passively choosing which water to drink. They were actively evaluating, treating, and modifying it to suit their needs. As civilizations grew, large states pushed this technological transformation even further. Monumental aqueducts, complex pipelines, sophisticated drainage systems, grand public fountains, steaming baths, and subterranean sewers demanded precise surveying, advanced engineering, structured taxation, immense physical labor, and highly organized administration. Admittedly, these grand systems did not completely eliminate deadly waterborne diseases. The legendary Roman water networks, for example, were incredibly impressive feats of engineering, yet they remained deeply vulnerable to organic contamination, plagued by poor maintenance, and restricted by highly unequal access. Yet, the broader human achievement was nothing short of extraordinary. Diverse human communities had successfully converted scattered, intuitive knowledge about flowing springs, muddy pools, unpredictable rainfall, and hidden groundwater into a cohesive, shared infrastructure. Clean, safe water was never simply discovered sitting idle in nature. It was patiently negotiated, brilliantly engineered, deeply ritualized, and fiercely defended. Today, clean water arrives in our lives so quietly, so seamlessly, that most of us only ever notice its profound presence when it suddenly stops flowing. You casually turn a metal handle, and centuries of collective human engineering instantly materialize before you in a simple glass of water. Behind that effortless stream lie protected reservoirs, advanced treatment plants, massive pumps, labyrinthine pipes, precise chemical testing, sophisticated filtration systems, and entire specialized professions quietly devoted to preventing your simple breakfast from becoming a tragic epidemiological event. It feels completely automatic to us today only because modern civilization has so elegantly, so thoroughly hidden the monumental effort behind it. Ancient humans harbored no such comforting illusions. To them, water was not a passive resource, but a dynamic, living relationship with the surrounding landscape. They knew all too well that a once bountiful spring could suddenly weaken to a mere trickle. A stagnant pool could silently spoil and turn poisonous overnight. A rushing river could violently flood, unpredictably shift its course, or carry unseen, deadly waste from some distant place upstream. Survival in this fragile existence depended entirely on keen, unwavering attention, on remembering the subtle shift of seasons, recognizing the quiet warnings of local plants, following the instinctual paths of wild animals, tasting each precious drop with extreme caution, digging patiently into the dry earth, and listening with deep reverence when an elder softly warned, "Not that one." This does not mean these early humans were somehow healthier, physically stronger, or naturally immune to the ravages of microscopic parasites. On the contrary, countless people fell gravely ill, and innumerable young children tragically perished from painful infections and rapid dehydration. The true triumph of our resilient ancestors was not that contaminated water miraculously failed to harm them. Rather, it was that, through trial and sorrow, enough of them learned. They painstakingly transformed bitter experience into vital warnings, those warnings into sacred customs, those customs into rudimentary technology, and that technology into enduring institutions. Thus, a simple, shallow hole in the wet earth slowly became a carefully lined well. A primitive storage pit evolved into a stone cistern. A dugout channel grew grander into a magnificent aqueduct. A simple, shared communal rule about protecting a precious spring eventually blossomed into strict sanitation law, modern public health, and our contemporary, absolute expectation that a clear glass of drinking water should never contain anything possessing its own active reproductive strategy. This profound history also clearly explains why reliable access to safe water remains, even now, one of civilization's most stark and tragic dividing lines. The fragile difference between absolute security and utter disaster is often not simply whether water exists at all, but whether a community possesses the collective ability to protect, transport, test, and share that life-giving liquid reliably and equitably. So, how did those ancient humans truly survive without pristine, clean water? The truth is, they very often did not have perfectly clean water at all. Instead, they relied on sharp judgment, high mobility, deep cooperation, carefully accumulated generational knowledge, and a gradually improving ability to make otherwise dangerous sources of water slightly less perilous. And so, every single time you dismissively reject a fresh glass of water simply because it has been sitting quietly on your table for a mere 6 hours, gently remind yourself that your resilient ancestors once anxiously evaluated their drinking water by peering closely to see if the small frog living inside still looked healthy. We have fully inherited their deep, instinctual caution. We have simply, and very conveniently, outsourced the puddle.